When I started as a mechanic, there were some topics that were highly debated. When I started working at Volkswagen and met engineers and managers, I found that some topics continue to be greatly debated. And one of them is regarding automatic transmission fluid, changing the fluid, and the interval and the amount and all of these things. So I'm going to share with you what I know about the topic, and that may be helpful for you. Some people approach it as a mechanic, some people approach it as an engineer, and I'm not the only one in the world who has this benefit, but I've kind of seen the topic from several different angles, and I want to offer that to you so that you can make your own decision. Okay, a couple things about automatic transmission fluid and how it's distinctly different from engine oil. The primary purpose of engine oil is to lubricate moving components so that they don't have increased friction and have basically galling. So metal surfaces don't like to rub on each other, and if they do that too much, you get heat and you get problems in the metal. Automatic transmission fluid does that as well. It also helps the transmission stay cool, but what makes it really different is that it has detergents in it. And those detergents are meant to break down grime and buildup, because inside of an automatic transmission, you have something called valve body. I'll let you Google that, but it's kind of like a carburetor on steroids. There's lots of little teeny tiny passages. There's lots of little tiny spring-loaded check valves. There's little regulation valves that have seats, and if those seats aren't sealing, you have problems. And so the inside of a transmission has to be really, really, really clean. And unlike an engine, which can actually get built up with a lot of sludge and it not be a super big deal, automatic transmission fluids have to be super clean. And what you probably know intuitively about detergents is when you start to wash your hands, at some point you get so much grime into the detergent, or the detergent gets so much grime into the lather that you have to rinse and start over. And so that's one of the reasons that transmission fluid needs to be replaced, is so that you get fresh sets of detergents. Now, if your transmission starts to get gunked up, you'll start to have shifting problems, primarily because the valve body and all the little passageways and all the little valves aren't working properly. Now, those are the key differences. What you may have heard is, if you haven't changed your transmission fluid at 100,000 miles, don't bother doing it at all, because it'll create new problems. That's not true, although within a certain context it is. The context in which that's true is that you may have no perceivable drivability issues with your car, and you might think you have a perfectly working transmission, and you change the fluid, and all of a sudden you start having symptoms and problems. And in that sense, changing the transmission fluid created problems. But that's really only half the story. The other half of the story is that inside of your transmission, even though an automatic transmission doesn't have a clutch pedal, you have tons and tons of clutches. And clutches are basically series of plates, and plates coated in a frictiony material. And they're called clutch packs. You'll have maybe 10 or 15 discs in a pack, and they open and close, and they allow this shaft to connect to this shaft, or to disconnect. And you'll have many of them, 5, 6, 7, something like that, let's say. Now, in order for those clutches and discs to stick and grab each other properly, and then unstick and slip properly, you have to have the right type of fluid. Too thin, like water, and you'll have problems. Too thick, like gear oil, and you'll have some problems. Now, that frictiony material, just like brake pads and just like the clutch on a manual transmission car, will wear out over time. And just like the end of your pencil, just like you have to sharpen your pencil, and just like the eraser goes away, it is normal wear and tear for these things to basically break up and disperse. Now, when the clutch material, which is quite frictiony, breaks off and wears off of these surfaces, it gets suspended in the fluid. And so you can imagine all these little bits of friction material are floating around in your transmission fluid. They're being all mixed up. And what that does is it creates a more viscous or a more sticky transmission fluid inside of your transmission. Now, if you go and change the fluid, then all of a sudden you go back to the original clean viscosity without all this extra bits. And if your transmission is worn out or near being worn out, then that thinner, less frictiony fluid can trigger a symptom. And for you as the customer who all of a sudden has a new symptom, you perceive it as changing my transmission fluid just ruined my transmission. And it's not really true. The truth is that your transmission was essentially already ruined or on its way or very close to being ruined. And by changing the transmission fluid, you revealed that problem earlier than if you had just kept driving it. So there's kind of this, old wise mechanic idea of, well, if the transmission's over 100,000 miles and you haven't changed the fluid, don't do it. And then there's this newer modern idea that says you should change it anyway, and transmissions aren't like nowadays, modern transmissions aren't like the ones from 50 years ago where this rule was true. And I'm not able to give a complete and comprehensive answer on that. It would be foolish for me to try. I do want to, however, offer you another perspective that may not be obvious to everyone. In a company that's producing cars like the one I worked at, Volkswagen, there are many departments who want different things. The engineer wants to be proud of his work and wants his product to have a reputation for reliability. The procurement and purchasing guys want the vehicle to be purchased cheap so that profit margins will be high. Salespeople want the product to be attractive so that they can sell a lot. Now, the sales department and also the customer service department, which are normally combined in some way, and the engineering department are essentially at odds because the engineers who know these things would like the fluid, whether that's brake fluid, coolant, power steering fluid, whatever, they want those fluids to be changed regularly, very regularly, so that there's no corrosion, there's no buildup, there's no problems at all. But the sales and service guys say, listen, I can't sell a customer a $40,000 car and then tell them every year they have to come in and spend $600 on all these fluids. We're not going to do that. We're not going to be competitive. No one else in the market's doing that. And so you have these forces in the company that are both pulling in different directions, and eventually they land on a compromise. Now, different companies land on different compromises. That's why some vehicles have become known for reliability and longevity, whereas others haven't. And in some cases, the ones who haven't are selling a less expensive car. And so there's an aspect of you get what you pay for. The other thing that comes into play is that different manufacturers have a different concept and idea of what end of life means. So at Volkswagen, it was 10 years, 200,000 kilometers. So basically, there were certain components that were considered lifetime components, like the fuel pump. No customer thinks that they should have to replace their fuel pump every 6 or 7 years. But every customer knows that you have to replace brake pads, windshield wipers, even spark plugs, things like that. So the company will designate certain components as maintenance and wear and tear, and certain components as lifetime. The goal then becomes for the developer to create a product that will last the specified lifetime of the vehicle, which can vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, although 10 years and 200,000 kilometers is a bit of a norm. Now, the manufacturer and the engineer then have the option to exceed or far exceed this end-of-life requirement. So they may say, I'm going to design the fuel pump in a way, not so that it breaks at 10 years, 200,000 kilometers. No engineer has the ability to foresee that in the future. But they can do cycle testing, and they can see, okay, the fuel pump motor brushes or the fuel pump check valve is able to last 5,000 cycles, and 5,000 cycles translates roughly to 10 years. So that means we kind of know they're going to fail at 10 years. And we could upgrade the rubber to, higher quality nylon or something, but it would cost 6 cents a diaphragm and 12 cents a fuel pump because there's two. And we don't want to do that because we're hitting our end of life requirement. And so they stop. So all of this plays into this topic of what's called COO, cost of ownership. So at Volkswagen, there was an entire department with a department head who always was looking at cost of ownership. They were looking at maintenance costs, repairs costs. They were looking at if you have like a certain type of car crash, how many components are damaged, because that influences insurance costs. And they're always trying to make the car as least expensive as possible to own and maintain. And there comes in this tension of they'll go to Eisen, the largest manufacturer of transmissions in the world, or ZF, and they'll say, what's the maximum we can get away with before, you won't warranty the item anymore or something like that, or we're going to have durability problems. And it will be a window, because even though it's science, it's not an exact science, because conditions change, how customers use it change, how often the customer lets it start in idle changes, all of these kinds of things. And they come out with a range. And one of the things that they want to do, they're motivated to do as a company, is to make certain fluids lifetime fluids, which means they get to tell the customer, oh, you don't ever have to change this fluid. It's built and designed for the life of the vehicle. There again lies the question, what does life of vehicle mean? Anyhow, so there was transmissions that came out like 15 years ago that said lifetime fill. And if you knew competent mechanics who were working on these things, or if you ended up meeting the engineers behind these things, they would basically say, well, of course, that's not true. Nothing is lifetime fill. No oil is going to lubricate an engine properly and adequately for an entire lifetime. It's going to do a better job in the beginning and a worse job at the end. As an example, with lawnmowers, Briggs & Stratton just recently came out with a never change the oil, just add when low. And I did some research to find out if they'd come out with some new technology, and they hadn't. They had basically just done some studies to find out that if they use a high enough quality oil from the factory, that oil will last long enough and keep that mower going long enough that when it dies, the customer will say, well, I got 8 years out of that mower, or I got 12 years out of that mower. That's good enough. No one at the company would say that it hurts the engine to change the oil. And almost every engineer would say, if you do change the oil, you'll extend the life of the product. They're really just describing minimum action, minimum requirements. And that puts the ball back in your court as the vehicle owner or the homeowner or whatever to say, well, Honda is telling me I can go 90,000 miles before I change this fluid, but would 70,000 be better? Would 50,000 be better? Well, almost certainly. It really comes down to your budget, your stomach, your tolerance for disappointment and pain if something fails, your ability to fix things yourself, and really kind of where you want to land on the safety ratio perspective or spectrum. So last thing I'll offer is, if you look at the specifications for transmission, there's normally two specifications. The first is what they call like a dry fill. So basically, if you get a brand new transmission that doesn't have a drop of oil in it, it's going to take, let's say, 8 quarts. But if you do a drain and fill, where you take out the drain plug or you pull down the pan, if it's that style, you're going to need to replenish with 5. And of course, that second number is always way lower. That's because there's a bunch of fluid in the valve body, there's a bunch of fluid in the torque converter primarily, and then there's some throughout the passageways and things like that. Plus the clutches are wet and all that. So what that means is that when you go to change your transmission fluid, you're really not changing all of it. Now that's a little bit different with an engine. With an engine, when you drain engine oil, you're draining 98, 97% of what's in there, especially if you change the filter, because there's really nowhere for it to sit. There's very few places for it to sit. Transmissions are different. So what I like to do with transmissions is, if it says that a drain and fill is 4 quarts, I'll buy 8 quarts. And then what I'll do, and this is what I'm doing today, is I will drain and refill the 4 quarts, and then I'll go for a drive. Well, I'll check the level, make sure the level's right. Then I'll go for a drive, make sure everything gets nice and hot, all the way up to operating temp. Go for a drive, make sure it goes through all the gears, so it puts transmission fluid through all the solenoids, all the servos, all the passageways, and then I'll change it again. And then if you do the math on that, that means that 75% of the fluid has been changed instead of just 50% or something like that. If you were to do it again, then you'd get another 12.5% on top of 75. I'm not going to do the math on YouTube. I always do it wrong, probably. Anyhow, now you will hear someone say you shouldn't do that. And they'll say, and I think incorrectly so, they'll say the reason the manufacturers do it that way is because they don't want you to change all the fluid at once. They don't want to go from dirty, viscous particle oil to brand new oil all in one shot. They want it to be more gradual. That's not true. The reason the manufacturers don't subscribe or prescribe a different drain and fill method like I've just described is because it's too expensive and customers wouldn't put up with it. and again, it becomes a compromise. Because even the method I'm describing only gets you 75% new transmission fluid. You'd have to do it a few more times to get above 90%. And so it's just too much of a hassle, it's too expensive, and again, you have this compromise. So in the end, we live in a free country and a free world. You can change your transmission fluid whenever you want. But one of the greatest lessons I learned after spending almost 17 years at a big corporation is that the manufacturer, in some ways, is not always right, because within that manufacturer, there are many forces and interests that tug at one another, and the answer ends up being almost always a compromise of some sort. The other thing is they are trying to strike a balance between cost and benefit. It would probably be better to change your transmission fluid every week, but that would be absurd. And so you get this compromise. And so whenever I read instructions on the back of a label, or whenever I'm reading service instructions for anything, whether it's a refrigerator or whatever, I always take into account that although the engineer might want me to clean the condenser coils on my refrigerator every month, the salespeople don't want me to do that because they A, want to sell me another refrigerator, and B, don't want the customer to feel like they're buying this super high maintenance device. Ironically, you get the exact opposite. If you buy a dryer, I guarantee you this, if you go out and you buy a clothes dryer, it's going to tell you every month you need to take a spiral brush on a drill and you need to clean out the ductwork from the dryer exit to the outside of the house every month, which is insane. I do it like every 6 months, and even that, every year would be fine. The reason they do that is because the number one cause of house fires in the United States is dryer ductwork catching on fire. And I know that because when I was at Volkswagen, I was involved in fire investigation. And so that owner's manual was not written by the engineers, it's written by the lawyers. And so you start to develop just a bit of a sense of, okay, the lawyers are involved, the salespeople, procurement, finance, HR, manufacturing, manufacturability, design, engineer, all these little voices input into the owner's manual to kind of cover their ass and keep the product, in the market for long enough that they can meet customer requirements and demands, but not necessarily exceed them. Anyway, we're 17 minutes into a video on automatic transmission fluid. I hope this was interesting to someone. If you have some comments and you have some evidence for competing theory or ideas, I'm happy to hear that. I'm not the transmission guy, although I've worked with transmissions now for 20 years, and I think I have a bit of a unique perspective on them, but that doesn't mean I'm omnipotent on the topic. So chime in below if you disagree or if you agree. And at the end of the day, I'm just trying to offer one person's opinion and perspective to kind of a mysterious topic to maybe bring some clarity. But perhaps in hindsight, I'll only look back and say that I made it even more mysterious. All right, take care.